Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. My name is Philip Kennedy, and I'm the Vice Provost for NYU Abu Dhabi Institute Public Programming. So events like this. I just want to say, before introducing our guests, I'd like to just say something about the context in which this particular lecture is happening, which is it's the sort of what Professor Nabuda called the Khitam al-Musk, the musky seal of the end. It's a way of describing the fact that the thing that comes at the end of something is the best. I think that's right, Mohammed. Khitam al-Musk. So the conference which has been taking place over the last 3 days has convened by Professor Alan Fromhertz, who's somewhere in the room, who is a fellow of the Humanities Institute at NYU Abu Dhabi. Has been about the global Gulf, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean connections, comparisons, and contrasts. The other thing I want to mention before introducing Matthew Maclean is that we're very lucky to have Deborah Menz. She's at the back, and she's doing a graphic representation of the lecture today, which will be on display afterwards here, or we might move it into the reception area. And she heads the organization called VisThink Lab, which you can find out more about by visiting the website of. Well, I think the best thing is to ask Deborah at the end. So Matthew Maclean is an identical twin to me, although we look very different, in the sense that he's someone here who's full-time associated with the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in New York, but spends most of his time in the Emirates, which, like me, he's lucky to do. But unlike me, actually, he studies the Emirati history. He is a PhD candidate at NYU in the Joint Program in History and Middle Eastern Studies, where I'm actually based. And his dissertation, which his talk from today is drawn from, is entitled Infrastructures and Identities, the Transformation of Space and the Formation of the United Arab Emirates from 1950 to 1980. So obviously that spans the pre-Federation into the Federation. He studied at Yale, did his BA, then taught at high school in New York, history, which, as you can imagine, indicates that he's a great teacher as well as a great scholar. He did his MA at Georgetown in Arab Studies, and of course now the PhD, which he'll finish next year at NYU, inshallah. De Volentes, as we say somewhere in Europe. He's currently a Fulbright researcher in the UAE at excuse me, I've got to backtrack. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Al-Qasimi Foundation in Ras al Khaimah. Before that, in 2006 to 7, he was a Fulbright researcher at Zayed University, which one? In Dubai. And he's lived in Al Ain, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and now in Ras al Khaimah. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matthew Maclean.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that very kind introduction, and I only hope I can live up to it. And people keep telling me that this is a great title for a talk, and I hope that I can live up to the title as well. But you can be the judges of that. So, and thanks to the Institute team for inviting me, because I've been coming to various Institute talks over the past 2 years, and I'm honored to be one of these speakers, and having seen so many good ones myself. So broadly speaking, my research is about the development of infrastructure in the Trucial States and the United Arab Emirates, about the transformation of space we're all very familiar with, for those of us who live here, with the rapid development that's often portrayed in coffee table books with a then and now theme. And you see these photographs of Abu Dhabi, before Sheikh Zayed, and then today, often with the two photos of the same space juxtaposed. And this talk is about the actual transition between the then and now, and even more particularly about one particular road from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah, which was built from 1966 to 1969. Actually, the title might be a little bit off. It actually was not the first paved road in the Trucial States or in the UAE. That particular honor goes to Dubai town roads, which started to be paved in 1957. And in Abu Dhabi to the oil companies road out in the western region near Habshan, which was designed to make it possible for very heavy trucks to move from one place to another. But it was the first paved road between different Trucial states and is basically what today is the E11 highway. There's been some changes in the routes from Dera in Dubai through Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and up along the coast to past Al Jazeera Al Hamra to Ras al Khaimah city, where I live now. And we often think of roads as feats of engineering and urban planning, which of course they are. But as much as engineering, this road was a feat of politics, intelligence, and espionage. And building a road is one thing, okay? But who decides who gets the contracts? How do they get the power to make that decision? And who gets to take the political credit for building the road? The story of this road is the story of high-level intrigue and negotiations and maneuvers over these questions, of frustrated plans, of history sometimes shaped more by coincidence than by design or plan. At one point or another, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser were all personally involved in the discussions of the events that led up to its construction. And all of this plotting and counterplotting took place between 1964 and 1966. But even today, 50 years later, it's not possible to tell the full story because some of the documents in the British archives that are related to the construction of the road and the politics leading up to it are classified until 2026. So maybe I can come back in 10 years and see if there's more to tell. So basically, the talk will be in three parts. First, just a broad note on the historical context of the Gulf and mobility in the Trucial states, and then the actual events, the negotiations that led up to the construction of the Dubai Ras al Khaimah road, and finally a note on the importance of the road and of national infrastructure generally. Okay, so first the context, and we can ask a question that we've been asking for those of us that have been in this global Gulf conference for the past 3 days. We can ask a very basic question: where are we in the world? Where is the Gulf? And most people today, at least most people from, well, at least a lot of people will say the Gulf is part of the Middle East. It's part of the Arab world. And this, of course, is true. It is part of the Arab world. But historically, the lower Gulf, and I mean, by the lower Gulf, I mean what today is the UAE, Qatar, Oman. The lower Gulf's primary political, economic, and social connections have been directed more to the Indian Ocean world than to the Arab Middle East. And you can look at the map, and maritime geography goes a long way in explaining this. The Trucial states were governed by treaty relations with Britain, which governed from British India. And the Indian Ocean, and this is almost a cliche, but there's some truth to it, was a cosmopolitan, largely borderless world connecting the Gulf, both the northern and southern shores of the Gulf, to India itself, to East Africa, and so on. And the Gulf was, of course, connected to the Arab world, but one of the main routes of that connection was by way of Bombay, the steamship route. But after World War II, a grand reorientation took place. A variety of independent, bounded nation states arose both in the Indian Ocean world, in Africa, and the Arab Middle East. The discovery of oil in the Gulf and the reformulation of these older connections with the Indian Ocean world meant that the Arab world took on a much greater political role in the Gulf than before. So in short, the Trucial states' role in the Gulf and its place in the world was changing. It was moving from the polyglot, cosmopolitan Indian Ocean to the Arab Middle East, from the British Empire to a world of post-colonial emerging nation states, from the very periphery of the global economy to being a producer of one of the world's most important resources. And in many ways, the struggles over the construction of this one road from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah have their roots in the conflicts and tensions produced by this grand spatial reorientation. So before getting into the road itself, okay, here we go. I wanted to say something about mobility and movement in the Trucial states before paved roads. Transportation was, of course, very critical to a society where people moved seasonally to take advantage of different goods in different places at different times of the year. In fact, for many people, that was the only way to survive, was by seasonal migrations. And the vast majority of movement was by foot, by camels and by donkeys. The first motor car reportedly appeared in the 1930s or late 1920s, sources sometimes vary, and probably belonged to the British political agent. But there were, of course, no paved roads. There were only tracks, which were informal and accessible only to Land Rovers. It wasn't like anyone planned them. One truck went, and then the next one followed the tracks, and then the next one followed them, and so on. This map here, which is from the British War Office, and if you want to see the full map, you can go to the Mahatma Museum in Sharjah, where the full map hangs on the wall, is of these Land Rover tracks in the northern Emirates and along the coast. And actually, if you look at a road map of the UAE today, many of the UAE's roads follow more or less similar paths. And these ways, these paths took on added importance in the 1950s and 60s. Exploration for oil, the smuggling of guns and landmines through the backcountry, and the potential for political subversion made it necessary to secure rural areas and hinterlands for the first time. Of course, securing the hinterlands, one of the ways that you do this is by knowing what's there, by making them legible, which means by making maps. And so this map, of course, is part of the process of securing rural areas. Who did this? It was the British officered Trucial Oman Scouts, which was the first modern military force in the region. And they themselves were heavily engaged in building accessible Land Rover tracks to make mountainous areas, especially on the East Coast in Ras al Khaimah and Fujairah, more accessible to their vehicles. Carved out in the late 1950s and early 1960s, these tracks that the Trucial Oman Scouts created were the foundation of the road network we see today in those regions. So if you drive from Masafi to Kalba, or Kalba up north to Dibba, and then Dibba back to Masafi, you're driving through roads that have their origins in tracks created by the Trucial Oman Scouts. Now, of course, there were very few motor vehicles in the 1950s and 60s. It's hard to tell exact numbers, but my guess by 1965 is that there was probably somewhere around 1,000 motor vehicles in the entire Trucial states. The one statistic that I have for sure is that in 1967, there were 91 motor vehicles in Ras al Khaimah. But this was all a marked contrast with the rest of the Gulf, where things were changing quite rapidly. Kuwait and Bahrain had discovered oil, had begun to spend oil money, and many of the workers to build the Kuwaiti and Bahraini infrastructure came from the Trucial states. And it's often forgotten by a lot of residents of the Trucial states, or of the UAE today, that people from here, the grandfathers of Emirati citizens today, often went abroad to work, just as other people come here to work today. By 1965, about half of the adult male working population of Ras al Khaimah was actually working in Kuwait. When they returned home, they saw the difference between the advancing northern Gulf countries and the stagnating Trucial states. Abu Dhabi was exporting oil by the 1960s, and there were great expectations of and desires for development, but on the ground, very little was changing. And although the British had been present in the Gulf for over a century by this point, modern development assistance to the region had started only recently in the 1950s with the establishment of an agricultural research station in Digdaga, which is just south of Ras al Khaimah, trade schools in Dubai and Sharjah, and Al Maktoum Hospital in Dubai. And there were other forms of assistance as well. During World War II, citizens of the Trucial states had gotten British ration cards and so on. But formal development assistance in terms of a program that was planned and then carried out over the long term began only in the 50s. And much of this was in response to Saudi criticisms of the British role in the region made during the Brahmi crisis. And the Saudis said, look, we can help you more than these British who have been here for 100 years. But the problem that the British had was that the British economy of the early 1960s was not particularly strong, and very little money could be spared for what was still a very distant area that had never caused the British any serious political trouble. But it wasn't only these economic disparities experienced by Trucial state citizens working abroad. When they went to Kuwait and Bahrain, they encountered new ideologies and ways of thinking as well. And these included Pan-Arabism, Baathism, socialism, communism, various forms of anti-colonial and anti-imperial thought, which they then brought home. And for those who didn't go abroad, many of the same political ideologies came here in other ways. Most famously through Saud al-Arab Radio, which brought Gamal Abdel Nasser's speeches over shortwave radio to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and even remote areas in the northern Trucial states and Oman. And also Arab expatriate school teachers from Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, and other countries who brought these ideas to school children. But the appeal of Pan-Arabism was not limited only to people who were sort of disaffected and disenchanted with the status quo. One of the most prominent Pan-Arabists in the Trucial states, in the region, was in fact the ruler of Sharjah himself, Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan Al-Qasimi, here meeting with Nasser. This is from Instagram is a great thing. This is from his son's Instagram account here. Sagar bin Sultan Al-Qasimi was the only ruler who was an ideological, principled Pan-Arabist who followed Nasser because he really believed in Nasser's Pan-Arabism. The other sheikhs did follow Nasser, but primarily for instrumental reasons and pragmatic reasons of trying to get more money for aiding their own people. But Sagar bin Sultan Al-Qasimi is in many ways the protagonist of this story. So all of this created a dangerous gap. The disparity in development between Kuwait and Bahrain on the one hand, the Trucial states on the other hand, British inability to fund large-scale development programs to make up for that gap, plus the introduction of new anti-imperial ideologies. And so the result was that the British were held politically responsible for the lack of development, but they also did not have the financial means to remedy the situation. So into this breach stepped the Kuwaitis, who opened a development office in Dubai in January 1963. Now, Kuwaiti aid to the Trucial states itself was not new, but the opening of a formal political office for a coordinated development program was. And the Kuwaitis had previously supported education in Dubai and Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah more or less on an ad hoc basis. They had funded the dredging of Dubai Creek, but now they embarked on a more systematic program funding hospitals and schools. And these schools often had Egyptian and other Arab expatriate teachers who taught things, who taught Pan-Arabist ideology, who explained the importance of the Palestinian cause, who supported Gamal Abdel Nasser, and so on. And just the school is in some ways a metaphor for the political changes and the spatial reorientation that the Gulf was going through at this time, because the British, in some cases, gave the funds to build the physical school building, but the Kuwaitis would give the funds to hire the teachers, and in some cases pay stipends to the students as well. The Kuwaitis would pay for textbooks, and so on. And the teachers themselves came from the rest of the Arab world. So the school was a very sort of multinational, global place. But overall, the British tolerated the Kuwaiti presence because the Kuwaitis themselves really posed no threat at all to the political status quo in the Gulf. However, in late 1964, Egyptian President Nasser announced that the Arab League would also offer development aid to the Trucial states and sent a delegation to study the region's needs. And the delegation was greeted by cheering crowds in the towns that it visited. Okay, here we go. Here's the reception in Ras al Khaimah. Now, I mean, if you look at this photo, it doesn't actually look by our standards today like that's a lot of people. But you have to consider this is Ras al Khaimah, population 8,000 in 1964. And a significant portion of that population was working abroad. Almost all of the people in the photo are adult males. So if you take out the school-age youth and the women out of this, by my estimate, this is actually somewhere between 25 and 40% of the adult male population in Ras al Khaimah that turned up at one point to welcome the Arab League delegation. So the Arab League did a study of the region, and they went back and they said that their priority for development would be to pay for water pumps, for the digging of new wells, and most importantly, a road from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah, a paved road that would symbolize Arab unity by easing transit between several small Arab states. The rulers of two states, Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan Al-Qasimi of Sharjah and his distant cousin, Sheikh Sagar bin Mohammed Al-Qasimi of Ras al Khaimah, offered to allow the Arab League to open development offices along the lines of the Kuwaiti office in Dubai. However, unlike the Kuwaiti office, the British feared that the Arab League office would quickly become a center for the spreading of propaganda and subversive political ideas. And so this would be the key question. Would these offices be allowed to open? And the main task of British diplomats in the spring of 1965 was to prevent this from happening at all costs. So, okay. Now we get into the plotting and counter-plotting and intrigue. And here's, there's a lot of people involved, but here's just a basic list of the main characters. So the first British response to the Arab League proposal to open development offices and Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah's acceptance of those offices, the first British response was threefold. Okay, number one, they would found their own development office. By now, everyone's opening offices in the region, which would be called the Trucial States Development Office, or Maktab at-Tatwir, in Dubai. And this office would be charged with overseeing all of the development projects in the region. And also, perhaps even more importantly, with overseeing the personnel who were working on those development projects to ensure that they were politically trustworthy. The development office would be overseen by the Trucial States Council, which was composed of all 7 rulers of the Trucial States and the British political agent in Dubai. And they thought that this would be a good mechanism to ensure some local support for development, but also ensure some British control. And very mindful of their image, the British tried and failed to find an Arab citizen to accept the title of director of the office, because they thought, it would be better if we actually had, an Arab who was in charge of things, but it didn't work out. So the second thing the British did was that Glenn Balfour Paul, who was the agent on the ground in Dubai, and William Luce in Bahrain, Luce was the senior diplomat in the Gulf for the British at the time, they tried to convince the British Treasury to vastly increase aid to the Trucial States. And in particular, since they had heard that the Arab League was going to build the road from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah, Balfour Paul and Luce told their superiors in London that actually we should do this, okay? But they faced a problem. The road would cost over £1 million, and there were £200,000 available in the British budget that year. But nevertheless, the road fulfilled political requirements as Luce and Balfour Paul understood them, because a road is something that's visible and concrete, that people can see, and that is of immediate benefit to the people who are traveling on it. And because the road is such a visible project, the British could take political credit for it. And in fact, the road at the time, a paved road, made no economic sense at all to any development experts in the British government, who constantly counseled political officials who wanted it for political reasons that, a road would not generate the amount of economic activity in the Trucial States that would be necessary to pay for the road's own construction. Because like any other investment, you want a return on your investment. And in a place with about 1,000 motor vehicles, a long 100-something kilometer paved road that costs £1 million is not going to do much good. Thirdly, the British intelligence services paid special attention to Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan of Sharjah, who in February 1965 made a trip to Beirut to coordinate the Arab League's push into the Trucial States. The British ambassador in Beirut was James Craig, who until recently had been the political agent in Dubai, so he was very familiar with Sheikh Sagar's personality and opinions and so on. And Sheikh Sagar met with various Egyptian and Syrian officials on the trip, but the British tracked him, and he was also accused of hanging out with various communists and socialists and other suspect characters, accusations that were very likely used in a secretive campaign to discredit him back in Sharjah itself. You take photographs and then you send them back, and then they get spread and so on. So this is setting the stage now for the main conflict. And the meeting of the Trucial States Council, when Sheikh Sagar returned from Beirut on March 1st, 1965, would become absolutely pivotal. And Balfour Paul, the political agent, introduced this resolution here. And the resolution, which became referred to as the March 1st resolution, basically said, we accept development aid from everyone, but it has to come through the Crucial States Development Office administered by the British and by the local rulers. So in other words, we're happy to have the Arab League and the Saudis and anyone, for that matter, the Soviet Union itself, to contribute to the Crucial States development, but we have to actually control the funds and personnel. And support for this resolution became the litmus test for the support of the British, period, in the Gulf. However, Sheikh Sadr bin Sultan threw a wrench into the British works almost immediately. He announced at this same meeting that the Arab League would provide 1.5 million pounds in development assistance in the next week when Assistant Secretary General Syed Nofal would visit the Crucial States. Here we go back again to the protagonists. So now the British were very worried. You know, they had about 200,000 pounds in the budget, and here's the Arab League is going to show up next week with 1.5 million pounds. The situation didn't look really that good. But luckily for the British, Syed Nofal did not show up at all over the course of the next 2 months. There was rumor after rumor that he's going to be here, but he never was. But nevertheless, in spite of his non-appearance, this set off a race. Who could raise the most money, raise it quickly, and spend it in the most publicly visible way? And so the British went around and they asked the rulers of Qatar, of Bahrain, and of Abu Dhabi for funds, and of Saudi Arabia as well. But all of these were caught between competing political imperatives. So for the Qataris and Bahrainis, you know, they didn't want to be seen to contribute money to a British office, to a British development office. But at the same time, they were suspicious of rising pro-Nasser sentiment in the Gulf, which sought, in some cases, to overthrow their own governments. So the Qataris and Bahrainis kind of hedged and went back and forth. Here in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Shahbout, who was extremely anti-Nasser, promised 250,000 pounds. He actually contributed 75,000 pounds. But for those of you who know about Sheikh Shahbout, this is not particularly surprising. So the British, you know, they're going around trying to raise money again and again and again, without much success. But they decided to show the importance of adhering to the March 1st resolution and supporting the Development Office and towing the line by bringing Minister of State George Thompson to visit each of the rulers in the northern Crucial States. Now, Thompson ranked just below the Foreign Secretary and was actually one of the highest ranking officials to visit the Gulf in quite some time. And it would be his job to persuade each of the rulers to sign a pledge not to violate the March 1st resolution and to send a telegram to the Arab League to that effect. And Thompson would have to do that before Syed Nofal, whose trip kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. They'd have to do it before Syed Nofal actually showed up. So Thompson's trip was planned for mid-May 1965. All is well and good for the British. Thompson is coming. He will, you know, by his seniority, that will impress the local people and rulers, and everything will be fine. But then, right before Thompson was scheduled to arrive, Syed Nofal arrived. And he showed up indeed after a 2-month delay. So the British learned of this, and almost immediately, Glenn Balfour Paul, the political agent in Dubai, had to run around the northern Crucial States and meet with each of the rulers and do all of the things that George Thompson had been assigned to do. You know, and you have to think, you know, he's trying in 24 hours to get from Dubai to Fujairah, Ajman, and Al Quwain, because Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah were very much in support of opening Arab League development offices. But to get in 24 hours to Fujairah from Dubai, and then over the mountains again to Al Quwain and Ajman, at this point was very difficult without any roads and so on. When he got to Ajman, it was very late at night. He woke up, the ruler was woken up in his bed and sent out. He was not even given time to change out of his pajamas before meeting with Glenn Balfour Paul, which just shows the urgency of how fast Balfour Paul thought he had to get around from point A to point B. And also, it says something about the relationship, perhaps, between the agent and the ruler of one of the smaller Crucial States. Now, just after Balfour Paul made his rounds, Syed Nofal arrived. And he claimed to have 900,000 pounds in hand, and he got signatures from all 5 rulers of the Northern Emirates pledging to accept Arab League aid. So by now, it was pretty clear that the Arab League was ahead in the race with 900,000 pounds. The very next day, George Thompson arrived to make the same tour of the same rulers. And he and Balfour Paul went around and played every card they had, but really to no avail. Sagar bin Sultan in Sharjah was an ideological pan-Arabist who stood on principle and would refuse to accept British assistance, as he had done in the past as well. But mostly the rulers simply wanted to develop their own emirates, their own states, with whatever funds were available from whatever source. The ruler of Ajman, who had just been, had been dragged a few days before out of bed in his pajamas, told Balfour Paul, when people come to me and ask, what have the British done for Ajman? What am I supposed to tell them? And Balfour Paul didn't have much of an answer for that. And the simple fact was that the British had only raised, by this point, 390,000 pounds, and Syed Nofal was now promising 900,000. So by late May, Luce and Balfour Paul were more worried than ever. In correspondence with London, William Luce described a rather apocalyptic scenario. If Arab League development offices were allowed to open in Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah, the Trucial States would see propaganda, and then demonstrations, and then riots, and then armed rebellion, just like in Aden and Dhofar. And if the development offices were allowed to open, then Saudi Arabia and Iran would lose confidence in the British and the West and look elsewhere for assistance and security. Egypt, and quite possibly the Soviet Union, would gain access to the Gulf's oil and threaten the free world's economy. In short, the picture that Luce was painting was that if you allow Arab League offices to open in Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah, we will lose the Cold War. Now, I mean, it seems apocalyptic, but of course, what he's doing as a diplomat is trying to get the attention of people in London. I mean, he may have believed this himself, or maybe not, but he has to perform his role to get their attention and to get them involved. And his warnings were indeed serious enough that on May 10th, 1965, the British cabinet met with Prime Minister Harold Wilson in attendance, and they agreed to provide an additional £1 million for development in the Trucial States, provided that suitable projects were identified. Now, by that point, by mid-May, British intelligence sources in Egypt had procured both the list of Arab League priority projects and Syed Nofal's personal report of his visit to the Trucial States. So the British knew what the Egyptians were up to. And the first Arab League priority was the road from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah. So the British announced that would be their priority too. And to show that they were serious about it, they sent out Sir William Halcrow and Partners, the great British construction firm, to begin surveying the Dubai to Sharjah and then Sharjah to Ras al Khaimah route. Now, a surveyor standing out in the desert planning a road and taking measurements maybe is not that politically exciting, but in this case it was, because it showed people who were traveling between Dubai and Sharjah, the British were serious about actually doing something. Now, by late May, the plots and counterplots were piling up rapidly. 4 northern states, minus Fujairah, which changed sides repeatedly, were reportedly plotting to replace Britain with Egypt as a protecting power. So the way the Trucial States were organized was that the British were in treaty relations with each of the individual sheikhs and then pledged to protect that recognized ruler in power. And so the rulers are now plotting to boot out the British and replace them with Nasser. And Luce drew up a list of possibilities in response to respond to this if it ever happened. Number 1 was cutting off Sharjah's electricity supply, which was supplied by the British Royal Air Force Base in Sharjah. Number 2 was inciting tribes in the Sharjah interior to rebel against Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan. And number 3 was recognizing the independence of Hamriya, which is a village in Sharjah on the coast, which had long sought its own independence and recognition as the 8th Trucial State. Finally, Luce and Balfour Paul requested that all visas for non-Gulf Arabs that were issued in other embassies around the Arab world be personally approved by them before anyone from Egypt and Iraq and Palestine could come to the Trucial States. And finally, Luce asked for permission to issue what in this situation was the ultimate threat, to withdraw British protection from local rulers if they did not toe the line. And this was code for endorsing a coup from within a ruling family of a particular emirate. In other words, if Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan didn't invited the Arab League in, then the British could recognize another member of the Al-Qasimi family in Sharjah as the legitimate ruler of Sharjah. So Luce sent these options of what to do off to London. But the high-level Defense and Foreign Policy Committee was divided about whether the threat to withdraw protection from the rulers of Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah was actually a good idea. And so therefore, no recommendation from London was forthcoming, and Luce, de facto, was free to act as he saw fit. So British policy was made by the guy on the ground rather than anyone with high-level authority. By mid-June, various groups on both sides were intriguing against each other, trying to keep up the pressure on the various rulers to either support the Arab League or the British. And caught in the middle of all of this were really the rulers of Ajman, Al Quwain, and Fujairah, the three smallest states. Sharjah and Ras al Khaimah were definitely with the Arab League, but it was the other three who had gone back and forth at different times, and so the pressure was really on them. And for Luce and Balfour Paul, who kept hearing rumors that Arab League officials coming to open the development offices were going to arrive in the Trucial States at any moment, now they had a new problem, was how to prevent these people from actually getting to Sharjah and to Ras al Khaimah. Sagar bin Sultan threatened to send his son with a bunch of spare Sharjah passports to circumvent the visa restrictions, because Arab League officials from Egypt would have to get a visa from the British, which of course the British would deny in this case. But if they were given Sharjah passports, then of course they could come to Sharjah. There was no way to deny that. So the officials actually got to Doha. That's as far as they got on June 23rd. But they were stopped there. And the reason that they were stopped there was because Balfour Paul and Luce had ordered Dubai and Sharjah airports to close a few days before. And they figured that, well, if we can't be sure that everyone on a particular plane is a legitimate, i.e. not an Arab League official, a legitimate person coming to the Trucial States, then the best option is simply to shut down the airport and not allow anybody in. And they did this because at Dubai airport in particular, there were only 2 immigration officials at the time. I mean, imagine that. There were 2 immigration officials at the time, and they thought that if the Arab League officials arrive and there's a public demonstration to welcome their support, to welcome them, then the crowd will easily overwhelm whatever formalities are taking place, and the officials can easily slip off into the crowd, and then we've lost. But by this point, in late June, it was too late for the Arab League. On June 24th, the political agent, Balfour Paul, received a letter from 14 members of the Al-Qasimi family in Sharjah, recognizing Khalid bin Mohammed Al-Qasimi as ruler of Sharjah and deposing Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan for allegedly mismanaging the emirate's affairs. The Trucial Oman scouts arrested and exiled Sagar bin Sultan, who eventually went to Cairo. Sagar himself claimed that the letter was forged and therefore invalid. But since he was surrounded by Trucial Oman Scout soldiers and British officers, he had no choice but to go. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit difficult because some of the documents are still classified. There are, in the oral history and in written sources in Arabic, there are a lot of different accounts that kind of go around. But the one, the line that the letter was fake is something that I've heard again and again and again. By the way, I requested this past year that the documents be made public because they were scheduled to be made public in June of 2016, but the request was denied. So, but with Sagar bin Sultan exiled and out of power, the other rulers now fell back into line because they saw their own fates in the balance. And in any case, their support of Arab League assistance had always been more instrumental and pragmatic rather than ideological. So on June 30th, the Trucial States Council convened again, and all the rulers wanted the road. This was everyone's priority now, including among the people, because it had assumed a symbolic political status which was far beyond any economic importance. Now, it would seem straightforward. Sheikh Sagar bin Sultan's in exile. The Trucial States Council can build the road. It would have a British contractor like Halcrows, and so on. But the struggle was not over. First of all, the British, once again, did not have sufficient funds for road construction in their budget that year, and they wanted to begin the road immediately, again, to show maximum political impact. And second of all, Sheikh Sagar and the Arab League had not yet given up hope. Regular broadcasts on Saut al-Arab from Cairo, now sometimes featuring Sheikh Sagar himself, which gave them some added credibility, continued to criticize the British presence in the region. And on July 9th, 1965, the Arab League announced a boycott of the Trucial States Development Office, which all Arab League members were obligated to support. Now, one of those members of the Arab League, of course, was Saudi Arabia, whose King Faisal had told Sheikh Rashid of Dubai that he, Faisal, wanted to build the road. And the British, of course, were happy for Faisal to contribute to development in the region. Obviously, Saudi Arabia had plenty of money. So long, of course, as the development funds went through the development office and thus to Halcrows, to the British contracting company. But Faisal told the British that he would have to respect the Arab League boycott of the development office, and he would only fund the road independently, which meant that he could hire his own contractors. And the Trucial States Council of the seven rulers, they didn't particularly care one way or the other who built the road. The road simply had to be built. So they agreed to Faisal's proposal, and a new behind-the-scenes struggle for control of road construction and development began, this time between the underfunded British and Faisal. And Faisal designated Syed Rameh, the Saudi ambassador to Kuwait, as his point man for the project. And at the time, because the British handled the foreign affairs for the Trucial States, the ambassador to Kuwait was the closest Saudi ambassador to the region. And Rameh annoyed the British to no end. They really could not stand this guy. He repeatedly failed to show up for meetings. In the course of a single conversation, he would change his position multiple times. In correspondence, he would send contradictory messages, and so on. Now, my own take is that he was doing this by design, and it was all a delaying tactic, which, in diplomacy, this is what people do. And finally, sometimes in Kuwait, he wouldn't be available. At one point, he wasn't in Kuwait, and it was known that he was back in Saudi Arabia. And so the British sent their ambassador in Saudi Arabia. They said, could you please go find this guy, Rameh, somewhere in Jeddah, and actually, pin him down on his position on this road construction and get a very clear message and statement from him. And so the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia started, making some inquiries around town, and he learned that Syed Rameh would be leaving for Cairo in a few days on a flight. The flight would be leaving at 4 a.m. So at 4 a.m., the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia turns up at Jeddah airport and actually chased Syed Rameh onto the departing plane, where the conversation began. But of course, Rameh, he knew the score, and he knew the plane was going to take off, and he knew the British ambassador didn't have a ticket. So he just sort of, oh yeah, nice to see you. And then the ambassador had to leave the plane, and Rameh went off to Cairo. Now, the second problem the British had with the Saudis, first was Rameh himself, was simply one of timing. The British wanted road construction to begin immediately to fulfill their requirements of immediate visible impact. The Saudis had no similar sense of urgency. And once again, George Thompson was sent to the region, this time to meet with Faisal and explain the importance of immediate beginnings to things. And as time went on, the Saudi position became more and more inflexible. Faisal told Thompson that no Halcrows involvement would be tolerated. And Thompson asked, well, perhaps, consulting engineers and subcontractors and project supervisors and all these sorts of things. And Faisal responded that neither Halcrows nor any other British company could even be mentioned in correspondence with the Saudis. They would have nothing to do with Halcrows. And as the fall of 1965 came and went with no progress, the British decided that they would build the Dubai-Sharjah section of the road themselves. And Halcrows built that road in 1966. Here's this is today the traffic nightmare that you are probably familiar with. Halkros built the road in 1966, and this spurred the Saudis into action because now they feared, okay, if the British are already starting, we're going to lose the entire contract. So in May of that year, Faisal awarded the contract for the Sharjah to Ras al Khaimah section of the road to the Saudis' largest construction firm, the Bin Laden Company. But now there's another problem because the Bin Ladens were already, all of their resources were busy at the time building a military base in Saudi Arabia. And so through the summer of 1966, the British were kept writing, when are you going to start? When are you going to start? Where are you? And their anxieties about the lack of rapid progress increased. And finally, in the fall of 1966, various surveyors and engineers began to appear, and the road would be built by the Bin Laden Company from 1967 to 1969. And one of the subcontractors, by the way, on the Sharjah Ras al Khaimah section of the road was a young Dubai contractor. It was his second independent contract. His name was Khalaf Ahmed Al-Habtour, who now is one of the richest businessmen in the UAE. But this is one of the places that he got his start. So the road was built. But by the time it was actually under construction, the political struggles that had created the road were now a thing of the past. In August 1966, just as the Bin Ladens were about to begin their work, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan became the ruler of Abu Dhabi. And unlike his brother Shah Bout, Zayed was willing to spend Abu Dhabi's oil revenues on very rapid development. And the economy of the entire Trucial states, including the north, received a very large boost. And the expert predictions that the road would be a poor investment, that there weren't actually even enough vehicles or enough economic activity to make it worth building, were proven wrong very fast. And soon the development office and Zayed himself began sponsoring more construction of roads. And actually, now you had the reverse problem because you had a lot of money and it had to be absorbed somehow. And roads, as a capital-intensive, expensive project, were a perfect way to spend a lot of money. So this is actually one of the first road maps of the UAE road network from the British Archives. This is from a development division official. And it's a great map because not only does it show roads that would eventually be constructed, but it actually also shows who pays for them. So here we have Sheikh Zayed, who is building the roads within Abu Dhabi state, from Abu Dhabi to Al Ain, which was still called Barami, popularly at that time. Sheikh Zayed also built the road from Sharjah to Paved, and then the Saudis from Sharjah to Ras al Khaimah, and then from Ras al Khaimah to Digdaga. Now this is kind of a classic example of how some places become, which once were important, are no longer important. And why did the Saudis have this 14-kilometer stretch from Ras al Khaimah to Digdaga? This was in part a British offer to make peace for having stolen, basically, taken the Dubai-Sharjah section of the road out from under them. They said, you can build an equivalent length of road somewhere else. And the most important length of road would be from Ras al Khaimah to Digdaga. And Digdaga was the location of the British Agricultural Research Station. And so the idea was that if you build the road there, all the farmers in the area will be able to ship their crops to market in Dubai and Sharjah much easier. And today, Digdaga is a small rural place, and it doesn't seem that important. But for the British, it was extremely important. The other roads here were built by the Trucial States Development Office and funded by them. Of course, much of the funds that came to the development office actually came from Sheikh Zayed and Sheikh Rashid of Dubai. So you have the road from Masafi to Manama, and then up to Dibba, down to Fujairah and Kalba, and then from Fujairah to Masafi. Okay, and for a long time, the UAE road network looked sort of similar to this. Okay, but by this point, in '68 and so on, with rapid development, all of the dissatisfaction that had contributed to the Arab League's popularity and so on was beginning to dissipate. And only a few years later, the British themselves would withdraw their military forces from the region, leaving in place a new federation of 7 emirates. An opening ceremony for the road was held in early 1972, after federation and independence, in which the road was described by the Saudi Minister of Communications as an example of Arab brotherhood bringing tangible benefits to the people of the Trucial states. So why do roads matter? And what lessons does this story hold for us? Obviously, roads make it easier to get from point A to point B, but ease of travel has political implications. By intensifying the speed and frequency of economic and social contacts between people from different parts of the UAE, and before that, the crucial states, roads made possible the development of a truly national space. The road network made it possible for Emirati nationals to travel throughout the country to public sector jobs in Abu Dhabi, which were a prime source of employment, to UAE University in Al Ain, and to other spaces where UAE citizens and expatriate residents mixed in new ways. Now, of course, to some extent, this wasn't entirely new. There had been close economic and social connections between the various crucial states for quite a long time before. But what was new was the speed and scale of motor transport and the interactions that it engendered, which made possible an explicitly national identity arising out of these interactions that had not existed before. And this is reflected to some extent in the names of the E11 road that had originally been built by Halcrows here and the Bin Ladens here. In Dubai, it's Al Ittihad Road. Okay, and then you get into Sharjah and it's Al Wahda Road. And then in Ajman and Al Quwain, it's Ittihad Road. Again, all names which refer to unity and brotherhood and so on. But while the road network might be critical to nation building, to call it a national project obscures its origins in transnational politics and global shifts of power. And the Dubai to Ras al Khaimah road, in many ways like the United Arab Emirates itself, the roots of it lie in the post-World War II decline of the British Empire, the end of the old Indian Ocean trading system, and now the rise of nation states, and integration of the Gulf into the Arab Middle East. And like the road was then, the UAE and the Gulf today are a mix and balance of these three life worlds. A global economy centered in the West, well, at least now less so, the Arab world, and the Indian Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating and exhilarating talk. One question that has stuck to me now is roads connect people, right? So that's one way of identity building. What I'm wondering is who actually built the roads? That is to say, did members of the various crucial states themselves work as laborers in constructing these roads, and did that play then a role broadly in also in identity formation and so on?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. There's no, in the archives, there's very few records explicitly talking about the labor force, but I know from talking to people in Ras al Khaimah that there are a lot of older Emiratis who were the workers on the roads. Of course, it was one job that they had among many other jobs. One older gentleman I was talking to was like, "Oh yeah, I worked on that road," and it was great because I was also a taxi driver, and it made life a lot easier for taxi drivers. There was but not all of the workforce was from the crucial states, and this, in its own way, actually contributed to the formation of an identity of people that were from here. There were Iranians who worked on the roads as well. There were people who came from Oman and Yemen. The people from Yemen, especially if they were from southern Yemen or from Dhofar in southern Oman, because of the rebellion in Aden and the rebellion in Dhofar, if they came and were working on a project like this, the British always took note of that because the potential for subversion was thought to be larger. And then there were many cases on projects, not roads in particular, but in the oil fields, in quarries in Ras al Khaimah and so on, where locals would complain that, hey, these jobs are available, but they're not given to us. And us could mean people from the crucial states. It could mean people from a very particular location. It could mean Arabs as opposed to Iranians. It could mean a lot of things. So yes, the labor force and its makeup was critical as well to identity formation.
Thanks for a fascinating talk that links together the politics with the infrastructure. One thing you haven't mentioned is the involvement by the British military forces in road construction. And if you could go back to your map, sketch map, can you give us an insight into their contribution to it and the issues of them being shot at as they were constructing it? It's a fascinating mini story in itself.
Yes. So the Trucial Le Mans Scouts, they were critical to building roads, or at the time, not paved roads, but tracks that were accessible to motor vehicles to make the backcountry and mountain wadis more accessible to security forces. This happened in stages. It started in the late 1950s, and the first stage would usually be, that the rocks would be, like large rocks and boulders would be cleared out, often by Trucial Le Mans Scout soldiers who were from the local population in many cases themselves. And then, later the track would be graded so that it was a smooth path. And in some cases on the East Coast, there were points where the mountains came directly into the sea, and something had to be blown up to actually create a track that a Land Rover could travel on. So this was done by the Scouts and also by the ruler of Fujairah himself, Sheikh Mohammed al-Sharqi, who is doesn't get enough credit for road construction, and I think this was done. It was not always done without political conflict. Of course, in the Northern Emirates, as elsewhere, various people from a certain place said this is our territory and you have to ask permission first, and permission was not always asked first. So there were times when there were gunshots fired, and one case in particular, actually, it's better to do it on this map, but the road from Ras al Khaimah to Dibba, which was finally built and on the multi-lane highway that it is today about 12 years ago, I think, had been planned since 1981, but the tracks that had been created in that wadi back in the 60s were the cause of a lot of conflict. So. And oftentimes, it wasn't that people were opposed to the road, they weren't opposed to the road because they didn't want a road. They were opposed to the road because they hadn't been asked about it, and some negotiation would have to ensue. And to resist was actually to draw attention to themselves in a way that would create the situation that would lead to negotiations. So.
I was wondering, to what extent was there any sort of consultation with or negotiation with the Omanis in terms of linking and making sure that things come together? Especially, it's interesting because when you drive by Madha, you see a very small sign and you
Right.
go up, but it is linked to Sohar quite well.
Yeah, well, the modern road network that we see now, this road from Dubai to the Omani coast was built by Sheikh Rashid of Dubai with Dubai funds and so on. And this road from Abu Dhabi to Al Ain and then over to the Batna coast to Sohar was built by Sheikh Zayed with Abu Dhabi funds. And it is interesting, today, if you look at the roadmap here and remove the border, it still makes perfect sense. Okay, and it's historically this entire area of northern Oman and the Trucial states is one area, one social, political, economic realm, and the division is fairly recent. Back in the 1950s and 60s, and I know Johan Matthews here, he's done more work on this than I have, but one of the reasons that this division came into being was because of the Jebel Akhtar rebellion and then the Dhofar rebellion. And there was a lot of smuggling of landmines and guns and so on, which targeted Trucial Le Mans Scouts vehicles in the interior. And the roads were often built to get soldiers to these places and interdict smuggling efforts. But that's sort of the short version of that. Yeah. And then Medha, which you referred to as this enclave of Oman right here, the East Coast Road goes right by it. It's a great drive if you ever go out that way. But the border was not demarcated until sometime in the last 20 years. And I've read that before the border was demarcated, there was about 1 kilometer or 2 of road that wasn't paved because they didn't know yet which country it was in. Now it's, these things have been more or less settled.
Really just an informative question. you didn't talk much about Sheikh Rashid and where he fit into the international and sort of local politics of the story.
Okay, I didn't talk about Sheikh Rashid much or Sheikh Shahbout. Both of them were opposed to Arab League involvement, but at different levels. Shahbout was completely anti-Arab League, probably more so than the British themselves. Rashid was also anti-Arab League for a lot, and a lot of it has to do with domestic politics within Dubai and so on. But he was always suspected of the British of undermining their position for very good reason, because Rashid was the one who worked most closely with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And at some point during all of these negotiations over the contribution to the development fund and so on, King Faisal told Rashid that, look, I'll support you and just write the check to you, and then you do what you want with it. So Rashid was somewhere in the middle of basically everyone. He definitely was allied with the British in that he opposed the Arab League. He was definitely allied with Faisal, which the British didn't like. And the British always thought that, if push really comes to shove, Sheikh Rashid is going to do what he thinks is best for Dubai. And if that means following the Arab League in Nasser, that's what he will do. And in many ways, this didn't distinguish Rashid from Sheikh Sagar and Ras al Khaimah, who was pragmatically looking for funds to develop Ras al Khaimah, or from the rulers of Ajman, Al Quwain, and Fujairah, who were looking for any source of funds for their own emirates. But Rashid was more pro-British than them.
If there are no more questions, I have one question actually, which is more, which is something I've noticed driving to Dubai when I dare to do that, because I don't have an SUV, so I was that's irrelevant. To the question is, I've noticed that the road to Dubai, everyone's noticed this, of course, is lined with trees, and then it suddenly stops. And
that's the border. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you could say something about that, or if, is it relevant at all to this? To your history of the
infrastructure. The road from Dubai to Abu Dhabi actually was built a few years later and doesn't come into the whole politics of the Arab League and King Faisal and so on. But it was built a few years later and was absolutely maybe the single most critical road for the Federation. But nevertheless, in the early days of the Emirates, each emirate still had a very powerful local identity. And development funds were spent on the public space of each particular emirate by itself. Sheikh Zayed, of course, loved trees, and all the way up to Al Ain, you can see thousands upon thousands of trees planted on the highway. And there's a story about Sheikh Zayed going to UAE University to meet with students in the early days, and one of the students asks him, "Why are we spending so much money on planting trees?" And Sheikh Zayed looks at him and says, "So you know what trees will look like." I think this has just been one of those things that being on a highway with a lot of trees on it is sort of it. That you're in Abu Dhabi Emirate when this happens. The same thing goes for if you enter Sharjah Emirate, there's certain forms of decor that symbolize Sharjah that you'll see in Sharjah and Kalba and Dibba al-Hassan on the east coast, like the fences are the same. And so each emirate's urban planners and so on create a sense of space that identifies subtly, but if you look out for it, it's there with, it's a way to identify that particular emirate.
It's striking how sudden it is with.
Yeah. And if you're looking when you reach the border between Abu Dhabi and Dubai on that same road, the pavement also changes color. So. And it's interesting, one of the other things that is important about roads, which I'm sure you all know, okay, because people who live here can talk about mobility until forever, okay? We can talk about traffic. Right? And you can all complain about traffic more than people in Los Angeles or New York or anywhere else. okay? And they can complain about car accidents, and people can talk about airlines and airports and flights for a very long time, because this is one of the most mobile parts of the world. And mobility is really critical to identity, and the road network is part of facilitating this mobility. And many of the road problems that we have today, I mean, the excessive traffic jams, the accidents, and so on, if you look back at newspapers from the UAE in the 1970s, you'll see exactly the same thing. Okay? You'll see pictures of horrible car accidents. You'll see headlines that are like, traffic jam at 10 a.m. in the capital. Why is this? And so on. So these anxieties and concerns and collective experiences of mobility, or in the case of a traffic jam, of lack of mobility, are something I think that it's critical to, that over time has contributed a lot to forming a UAE national identity, and also to shaping expatriate identities as well. The experience of moving through space.
I don't know if there are other questions. I have one more question, if there isn't one more from our audience, our guests. But have you, but this is much later, have you studied the question of whether or not a train system is going to be built, and how that would compare to what you know about the road system?
Yeah, well, I think I speak for all of us when I say I hope a train is built between Abu Dhabi and Dubai very soon, right? But this train, I mean, Etihad Rail, it wasn't always called Etihad Rail, but there's been talk of a train since, well, forever. I've seen the map of where the train's going to go all the way from Abu Dhabi up to Ras al Khaimah. It's been built in the western region for cargo and fuel and so on, and it's supposed to open for passenger traffic. Stage 2 to Dubai, that last I heard the tenders have been delayed with the recent budget cuts, or at least some, maybe not cuts, but some retrenchment. And then stage 3 is from Dubai to Ras al Khaimah, which they know where it's going to go, but who knows when it'll be built. I wish it was built yesterday, but